Get those med bays prepped. I want isolation protocols locked down now. If this thing spreads on board, we're done. Dr. Leon Voss stormed through the main corridor of the Solace, shoving a diagnostic scanner into the arms of a passing medic. His breath came fast, the recycled air in the ship thick with the smell of antiseptic and metal. Every step of his boots against the steel decking felt like a countdown. They were already too late. Outside the viewport, the planet Dryneth 4 twisted in slow death. Cities once gleaming with alien life were now fractured husks, choked by a crimson haze that pulsed like a living thing. What should have been vibrant skylines were now ashen tombs, flickering with dying emergency beacons. 30 seconds to planetary descent, Commander Gareth Soren announced over the intercom, his voice clipped, urgent. If anyone wants to back out, say it now. No one did. The ship trembled as atmospheric resistance clawed at its reinforced hull. Through the cockpit's laser plasma displays, Soren saw firestorms raging across Dryneth 4's surface, consuming entire districts in apocalyptic waves. Thick black plumes spiraled into the sky, feeding the violent storm clouds above. Sergeant Gideon Cray, fully armored in combat exogear, checked his rifle before glancing at Voss. You better tell me there's something down there worth saving, Doc. Voss exhaled sharply. If I knew, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The Solace pierced the troposphere, diving between crumbling skyscrapers. The smell of burning infrastructure and decomposing organic matter filled the cabin as air filters struggled to keep up. From above, the city looked like a corpse mid-autopsy, dissected, half-decayed, and spilling its insides onto the streets below. A shrill alarm sliced through the ship. Heat signatures! Multiple contacts! The pilot, Julian Stroud, tightened his grip on the controls, forcing the ship into a sharp banking maneuver. The heads-up display flared with erratic motion. Shapes twisted and lunged below, figures that should have been dead moving in ways that defied biology. Confirm visual, Soren barked. Cray cursed as he zoomed in through his visor. They're not just infected, he muttered. They're mutating. From above, the creatures surged through the ruins, not shambling like the mindless infected of past outbreaks, but moving with eerie coordination. Their limbs elongated, torsos ruptured with new appendages, exoskeletal plating forming along their flesh in ways that suggested deliberate evolution, not random decay. Voss's stomach nodded. That's impossible. The virus shouldn't be capable of morphological restructuring that fast. Unless it's thinking, Ronan Vale finished grimly, stepping forward from the bulkhead. The ambassador's sharp eyes swept the horror below, and that means someone made it that way. The ship trembled as an unseen force latched onto the hull. Klaxons flared. "Brace for impact!" Stroud shouted. The Solace lurched sideways, metal shrieking under pressure. Outside, dozens of twisted figures had scaled the wreckage and hurled themselves onto the hull with unnatural strength. Their clawed hands dragged across the surface, seeking entry points, their hollow eyes filled with eerie intelligence. "Hostiles on the ship," Cray roared. "We need to clear them before they breach the airlocks." Soren was already moving. "Get to the armory. If they're that determined to get in, we give them a welcome they'll never forget." Voss swore under his breath. "We don't have time for this. We need a sample. One of them. Alive." Cray's expression was incredulous. "You want me to catch one of those things?" Before Voss could respond, a deafening screech ripped through the ship's frame, metal bending, something breaking through. "Too late," Soren growled. "They're inside." The corridor erupted in chaos. The first of the infected lunged through a breach in the hull, its bones snapping and reshaping mid-motion, a grotesque ballet of unnatural transformation. Steel-reinforced doors bent as though made of cloth, giving way to something neither fully alien nor completely alive. Cray didn't hesitate. His rifle roared in close-quarters fire, each round ripping through the shifting anatomy of the first creature, but instead of collapsing, the thing reeled back, flesh stitching itself together with sickening speed. "Regeneration?" Voss staggered back, pulse hammering. "That's not—" The second infected barreled through, claws tearing through one of the medics, lifting him clean off the ground. A gurgled scream, A sharp crunch, then silence. "Fall back," Soren ordered. "We need containment, now!" Vale grabbed Voss by the arm, dragging him away as fire rained through the passage, forcing the infected into temporary retreat. "If they get to the reactor, this entire ship is finished," the diplomat warned. Voss's mind raced. This wasn't just infection. This was evolution on demand. Someone had engineered this plague not just to kill, but to adapt, to learn. Then came the worst sound of all, a whisper through the comms, barely above static. "They are watching." For the first time, Voss felt something worse than fear. Confirmation that something was orchestrating this disaster. More screams echoed down the halls as another security team was ripped apart. Blood slicked the floors, pooling like ink on metal. The ship's automatic containment systems finally activated, slamming reinforced blast doors into place. Kray's armor was splattered with alien gore, breath ragged. "Tell me you got what you needed, Doc." Voss looked down at the shaking vial in his gloved hands, filled with a writhing, black-red fluid that pulsed like a living heart. "I got enough to tell you one thing," he said darkly. "This isn't a plague. It's a blueprint." Soren, standing over the still-twitching corpse of an infected, narrowed his eyes. "A blueprint for what?" Voss's jaw clenched. "Something worse than extinction." Silence fell. The only sound was the distant rhythmic knocking against the outer hull, like fingers drumming on a coffin lid. Then the power flickered, and the ship whispered back, "They are awake." The words slithered through the ship's comms like a whisper through dead air. Voss clenched his jaw, the weight of the vial in his grip heavier than it should have been. The containment doors groaned under their own weight, locking the infected out, but not before leaving behind the stench of ruptured bodies and the copper tang of fresh blood. A low, mechanical click. Then a voice, Soren's, cut through the tension, firm, but laced with something he rarely let surface: worry. "Stroud. Get us out of orbit. Now!" The pilot didn't hesitate. The solace rumbled beneath their feet as the thrusters fired, lifting the ship from the fractured corpse of Dryneth 4. Below them, the sprawling ruins shrank, but the horrors they had left behind still clawed at the edges of Voss's mind. Those creatures, their bone-knitted limbs, those eyes that weren't empty but calculating. This wasn't a disease. It was a transition. Soren exhaled through his nose, eyes locked on the heads-up display as the ship's trajectory recalibrated. "Vale, get a read on external comms. If we still have a channel open to Earth, I need to know how badly they've botched our reputation." Vale had already started, fingers flying across the laser plasma interface, his expression darkening as he scrolled through data streams. He didn't need to say it. Humanity had just been branded the architects of an atrocity. The Consortium already filed official charges. The claim? Vale's voice carried a blade of sarcasm. Biological warfare and planetary genocide. Voss let out a slow breath. Convenient. Makes you wonder how fast they typed up that accusation. Fast enough that the ink's probably still wet. Vale's lips pressed together. Theron Valen's rallying every empire that wants humanity wiped off the board. He's painting us as the ones who unleashed the plague. Soren's fingers tightened against the metal railing near the viewport. Then we're already at war. No one argued. Kray leaned against the bulkhead, armor scratched and blackened from close-quarters fire. He'd barely spoken since the breach. The blood on his gloves wasn't just from infected. One of his own men had died trying to hold the barricade. That weight was setting in now, thick in the room like the stifling, sterilized air filtering through the vents. Voss broke the silence. "We have bigger problems. The sample's reacting." He brought up the scanner display, tilting it towards Soren and Vale. The vial's contents, deep crimson, bordering on black, had begun shifting, coiling like something restless, something dreaming. Tiny ripples pulsed through the liquid, almost as if it was responding to the ship's systems, aware of its containment. "That isn't natural," Vale murmured, eyes narrowing. "Neither is anything about this situation," Voss set his jaw. "The mutations were one thing, but this is a pathogen that's not just evolving. It's waiting." Kray exhaled, straightening. Waiting for what? Before Voss could answer, the ship's security grid flared, red warnings splashing across every screen. A new voice cut in over the intercom, thick with urgency. Unidentified ships just dropped out of FTL. They're on an intercept course. Fast. Soren turned sharply toward the display. Who? The officer hesitated. No known transponder, but their vector suggests they've been tracking us since Dryneth 4. Vale cursed under his breath. This just keeps getting better. Voss turned to Soren. You think it's Valen? Soren's jaw clenched, gaze unreadable. I think if they were Consortium ships, they'd have already opened fire. No, this is something else. Or someone else, Vale muttered. Someone who doesn't want us getting back to Earth with that sample. The realization settled like a stone in Voss's gut. The creatures on Dryneth 4 hadn't been mindless. They had hunted, adapted, evolved. Whatever intelligence had shaped them had not been random. And now, whoever had let the plague loose was making sure its secrets stayed buried. Incoming hail, the officer confirmed. It's encrypted, not Consortium code. Patch it through, Soren said, arms crossed, eyes locked on the main display. The screen glitched for a fraction of a second, then stabilized, revealing a man in black combat gear, helmet half-shadowing his face. His features were hard, sharpened by war, the kind of man who had seen too many battlefields and walked away every time with fewer pieces of himself intact. The stranger's voice was low, deliberate. You have something you shouldn't. Soren didn't flinch. You're going to have to be more specific. We've picked up a lot of things we shouldn't lately. The man's lips twitched. Not a smile, not a threat, something in between. You have Galahad's key. The word Galahad sent a current through the bridge. Vale's expression darkened. That's a name we weren't supposed to hear. Which means, the stranger continued, you're already dead men walking. Cray scoffed, rolling his shoulders. We've heard that before. You haven't heard it from me, the man replied coolly. Now listen carefully. I'm offering you one chance. Hand over the sample. Walk away. Stay out of this war. Silence. The only sound was the soft thrum of the ship's life support cycling recycled air. Soren didn't move. Didn't blink. And if we say no? The man exhaled like he had expected that answer but still found it disappointing. Then you won't live long enough to regret it. The connection cut abruptly. Multiple lock-ons! The tactical officer's voice cut through the silence. They're arming weapons! Shields up! Evasive pattern! Soren barked, already moving. The ship lurched sideways as energy blasts ripped through space, barely missing the hull. The crew braced, alarms screaming through the command deck. They're trying to disable, not destroy, Vale shouted over the chaos. They want the sample intact. That makes one of us, Voss muttered. Cray spun toward Soren. Orders? Soren's eyes burned cold. We show them why you don't back a wounded animal into a corner. The Solace shuddered, thrusters burning white-hot as Stroud pulled them into an aggressive countermaneuver. The void outside the viewport erupted with fire, shadows twisting against the cold light of distant stars. Voss tightened his grip on the vial, feeling its pulse against his palm. Whoever this enemy was, they were willing to risk everything to keep Galahad buried. Which meant one thing. It was time to start digging. The Solace jolted under another impact. Warning sirens flared, pulsing through the command deck as static crawled across the laser plasma displays. The enemy ships were faster, sharper, their weapons moving like a hand closing around a throat. Shields at 60%, the tactical officer called out, fingers moving with controlled urgency. We won't last another direct hit like that. Then stop giving them a clean shot, Commander Gareth Soren ordered. His tone was steady, but his knuckles whitened against the console. Stroud, break for the debris field. Make them work for it. On it. Julian Stroud, the pilot, gritted his teeth and pulled the Solace into a reckless dive. The black expanse ahead fractured into a graveyard of shattered ships, derelicts left to drift in silence, some torn apart as if by monstrous hands. The ship twisted between the wreckage, weaving through shadows and jagged metal, forcing their pursuers into a more chaotic chase. Turbulence rattled the hull, the groan of straining metal underscoring the weight of every maneuver. Sparks erupted from a nearby console, showering a technician in flickering light. "They're adapting to our movements," Ambassador Ronan Vale observed, watching the enemy's pattern unfold across the heads-up display. "Whoever they are, they're not just bounty hunters. They're tacticians." "Then we give them something unpredictable," Soren muttered. "Stroud, cut thrusters and kill the main feed. Let inertia take us in." The solace went dark. The moment the main thrusters cut, gravity lurched sickeningly, sending unsecured tools and debris drifting into the air. The enemy ships streaked past, their scanners momentarily losing their lock. "Smart," Vale said, impressed. "Now what?" "Now we find out who's desperate enough to chase a medical ship into a graveyard," Soren said, eyes locked on the tactical screen. From his station, Sergeant Gideon Cray let out a sharp breath, checking the charge on his rifle. "If they board, we make them regret it." "We don't have time for another fight," Dr. Leon Voss cut in, stepping forward. The vial in his gloved hands quivered, its contents shifting like something trying to wake up. "This isn't just about surviving. We need answers." A cold dread curled in his stomach. That word, Galahad, had sent a tremor through the enemy's comms. Someone out there knew what it meant. Vale studied the flickering data streams. "There's a research station nearby, Valcor 7, old Consortium black site." Soren gave him a sharp look. "And you just happen to know that?" Vale smirked. "I make it my business to know where powerful people keep their secrets." Stroud brought the ship around, maneuvering toward the derelict station drifting just beyond the wreckage. As they closed in, Valcor 7 loomed like a carcass picked clean, its docking bay doors frozen half open, the hull scarred by energy blasts. "That place looks about as inviting as an open grave," Cray muttered. "We don't have a choice," Voss said. "If the virus has anything to do with this Galahad project, then that station holds the missing pieces." Soren exhaled through his nose, then nodded. "Fine. Vale, Cray, Voss, you're with me. Stroud, keep the Solace ready for a quick exit." The docking clamps engaged, the hull shuddering as they made contact. The airlock doors groaned open, revealing a corridor choked with floating debris and the weight of something long abandoned. Voss took the first step inside, his boots stirring dust that had been untouched for years. The walls were streaked with charred handprints, frozen mid-scrape as if people had been trying to claw their way out. Cray swept his rifle across the corridor, the dim emergency lights casting long shadows. "I don't like this." "You don't have to," Vale muttered, stepping carefully over a shattered console. "Just stay alert." They moved deeper, past corridors lined with shattered containment pods, their interiors scorched as if something had burned its way out. The silence was heavy, like the station itself was holding its breath. Then the power flickered. A low, automated voice crackled to life over the intercom, a final recording caught in an endless loop. "They are watching. They are waiting. Initiating lockdown." Static swallowed the rest. "That's comforting," Cray muttered. They pushed forward until they reached a central lab. The doors, rusted from neglect, resisted before groaning open. Inside, rows of storage units lined the walls, their contents sealed beneath thick glass. Some held decayed remains, others, something less identifiable. Voss stepped closer to a terminal. The interface was dead, but when he placed his hand on the surface, a faint glow pulsed beneath his palm. The station recognized his genetic signature. The screen flickered back to life. Files unfurled, streams of code unlocking decade-old secrets. Project Galahad. Vale's breath caught. "What the hell is this?" Voss scrolled through the logs, his eyes narrowing. The virus wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to awaken something dormant in human DNA. The realization clawed at him. The genetic anomalies, the way the infected weren't mindless, but evolving. This wasn't a plague. It was a test. The terminal beeped. A single entry decrypted itself. A final message buried deep. A name appeared. Dr. Adrian Falk. Voss stiffened. His blood ran cold. Falk had been one of Earth's top geneticists. He had died years ago, or so they'd been told. Cray's grip on his rifle tightened. I'm guessing we just found our next lead. The screen flickered again, but this time it wasn't data appearing. It was a live feed. Somewhere, deep within the station, a figure shifted. The grainy image showed a man strapped into a medical chair, tubes running from his arms into an array of machines humming with unnatural energy. His head tilted up. His eyes, black as the void between stars, snapped open. Then the station's alarms roared to life. Containment breach. Initiating protocol Theta 9. Purging facility in 5, 4, 3. Move! Soren barked. They ran. The station began to implode, bulkheads buckling as automated defenses whirred to life. Cray shouldered a collapsing doorway aside, allowing them to sprint for the docking bay as the corridors cracked under the weight of their own destruction. Stroud's voice roared through comms. Docking clamps disengaged. If you're not on board in 30 seconds, you're staying. The Solace loomed ahead, airlock still open. The station shuddered violently, fire bursting through the corridors like the station was bleeding from within. Voss dove through the threshold just as the Solace ripped free, engines burning as the station detonated behind them in a silent, catastrophic burst of light and debris. Cray, breathless, turned to Voss. You still think this is just a virus? Voss's gaze darkened. No, he admitted. I think it's a message. Vale exhaled, tension lacing his shoulders. Then the only question left is... The intercom clicked. A transmission broke through static, a voice speaking 2 words. They know. The words lingered in the Solace's comms, a whisper laced with certainty. The transmission cut, leaving only the deep, rhythmic pulsing of the ship's reactor. Voss felt his pulse sinking with it, a slow, deliberate countdown to something inevitable. They were watching the station, Ambassador Ronan Vale said, breaking the silence. He sat on the edge of the command table, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the encrypted data pulled from Valcor 7. The second we accessed those files, they tagged us. Commander Gareth Soren stood with his hands braced against the console, reading over the same reports for the 3rd time, as if the words might change. Tagged us for what? If we already know the virus was designed to awaken something in human DNA, what else is there? Voss set the vial down, the liquid inside still coiled and uncoiled, like something dreaming behind glass. Maybe it's not about what we know, he murmured. Maybe it's about what we're not supposed to know. Cray exhaled sharply, sitting back in his chair, armored arms crossed. You want to spell that out, Doc? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a galaxy that's ready to burn us to the ground. Voss ran a hand through his hair, thoughts stacking unevenly. The virus, the station, the name that shouldn't have been in those files, Dr. Adrian Falk. We've been treating this like a puzzle, he said finally, trying to solve for an answer, but what if we're the ones being solved? What if the virus was designed to force humanity to evolve into something unnatural? Silence. Vale leaned forward, fingers tapping against the metal table. That theory leads to a question none of us are ready to ask. Soren's gaze flicked toward him. Which is? Vale's expression was grim. Why? The overhead lights flickered, as if the ship itself was hesitating. A notification flashed across the heads-up display, dragging their attention back to the moment. Incoming transmission. Terran High Command. Soren straightened. About time someone from home weighed in. He gestured to Vale. Patch it through. The screen flared to life, revealing the sharp-lined face of Fleet Admiral Lissar Carr. The man's uniform was pressed to near perfection, but the way he held himself, shoulders stiff, jaw locked, fingers curling just out of sight, betrayed tension. You were supposed to return to Earth 4 days ago, Carr said, skipping pleasantries. Instead, you've led this ship into a war zone and dredged up ghosts that should have stayed buried. Soren's expression didn't change. We had a situation. A situation, Carr repeated, voice edged with something razor-thin. Do you have any idea what you've done? The Galactic Consortium is calling for Earth to answer for the destruction of Dryneth 4. We're standing at the edge of a blade, and you've just handed them the reason to push. Vale folded his arms. You're worried about politics while we're dealing with something capable of rewriting human genetics? Carr's eyes flicked toward the diplomat. I'm worried about survival, something you've just jeopardized. Voss stepped forward. Admiral, we have reason to believe the virus is... Carr held up a hand. I don't want to hear it. You've already stepped too far into waters that were never meant to be crossed. Soren's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Not just with the situation, with Carr himself. His words were deliberate, but his posture screamed reluctance, like a man being forced to deliver a sentence he didn't agree with. You're ordering us to abandon the investigation, Soren said, testing the waters. Carr's silence was answer enough. Voss narrowed his eyes. Because someone on Earth already knows the truth. Carr's jaw tightened. His shoulders rose fractionally, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if the room wasn't already holding its breath. This is bigger than you, the Admiral said, voice flat. Bigger than this ship, this mission. I am ordering you to set course for Earth immediately. Cray scoffed, shaking his head. And if we don't? Carr's gaze sharpened. Then you will be marked as rogue operatives, and the Solace will be considered an enemy vessel. The words landed like a fist to the gut. Soren exhaled through his nose slowly. You're willing to shoot down one of our own ships. Carr didn't blink. This conversation is over. You have 6 hours to comply. After that, you are on your own. The transmission cut. For a long moment, no one spoke. The ship's systems hummed in the silence, filling the space between unspoken choices. Cray let out a sharp breath, arms dropping to his sides. We're screwed. Vale's fingers drummed against the metal console. Not yet. Voss looked up. What are you thinking? Vale exhaled, looking at each of them in turn. They want us back on Earth, which means they're afraid of what we'll find if we keep going. Soren straightened. Then we go deeper. Cray let out something between a laugh and a scoff. You're both insane. Voss stared at the vial of shifting liquid. Falk Galahad, the virus. It all pointed to something bigger than war, bigger than survival. Something buried. Something waking up. No, he said, voice steady. We're about to figure out what we were never supposed to remember. The ship's warning systems flared. Red indicators scrolled across the display. Multiple FTL signatures detected. Vale swore under his breath. They didn't even give us 6 hours. Soren turned toward the viewport. Pinpricks of light streaked across the black void, growing larger. Ships. Human ships. A fleet had come to erase them. Cray clenched his fists. So, what's the play? Soren locked eyes with Vale, then Voss, and for the first time, a slow, cold smile crept onto his face. We give them a reason to regret it. Soren's words hadn't even settled before the Solace's tactical display exploded with contact alerts, a rapid cascade of red markers blooming against the heads-up interface. Human ships. A full fleet. Voss's pulse hammered. They sent this many for us? Vale's eyes flicked over the incoming signatures. Number, this isn't a retrieval op. This is an execution. Cray's grip on his rifle tightened. Figures. They didn't like what we dug up, so now they're closing the hole with us inside it. Stroud's hands moved across the controls, redirecting the ship's power to evasive systems. Options? Soren exhaled through his nose, jaw clenched. We don't fight them. We outmaneuver them. The Solace veered hard, thrusters firing a controlled burst that sent the ship carving a tight arc away from the blockade. But even before they finished their turn, the fleet adjusted. They were waiting for this. Vale's voice was sharp. They're reading our movements before we make them. They're tracking us through the FTL field, Stroud realized. They've got our signature locked. Voss stared at the laser plasma display, watching the trap snap closed. If they didn't change tactics fast, they'd be vaporized before they even reached the outer markers of the system. Then something flickered at the edge of the screen. A dead sector of space, a place no fleet patrolled. Here, Voss said, pointing to the anomaly. That region. No patrols, no markers. It's the only blind spot they haven't covered. Stroud hesitated. That's because it's not mapped. No one goes there. Vale leaned in. That's a graveyard. Ships that entered never came back out. Which makes it our best bet, Soren decided. Cray let out a dry laugh. Right. So our choices are immediate death or probable death. Great. Then let's take the one that buys us time, Voss muttered. Stroud didn't wait for further debate. The Solace spun toward the dark sector, thrusters burning white-hot as the ship barreled into the unmapped void. The pursuing fleet hesitated, then adjusted their course. They were coming in after them. The instant they breached the unknown region, everything shifted. The sensors flickered. Readings stuttered. The ship's instruments, so reliable just moments ago, now fluctuated between complete silence and garbled static. Cray stiffened. What the hell is this? Voss studied the erratic signals dancing across the console, his fingers tightening over the edge of the interface. It's a blackout zone. Something here is interfering with all known tracking systems. Vale's brow furrowed. A natural phenomenon? Soren's expression darkened. Or something that was built to be forgotten. They weren't alone. The skeletal remains of ships drifted in the darkness, hulls pitted, some torn apart as if something had ripped into them from the inside. Wreckage spread in all directions, each fragment a story of an attempt that had ended in silence. A static burst cracked over the comms, then, "Don't follow the light." The transmission was weak, degraded, but the voice carried weight, a presence behind the distortion. Cray exhaled slowly. "Tell me someone else just heard that." Stroud swallowed. "Heard it. Just wish I hadn't." Voss felt a cold coil of unease twist through his ribs. "Play it back." The message looped, but this time it came with coordinates, a location buried deep within the blackout zone. Vale glanced at Soren. "Thoughts?" The commander's expression remained unreadable. "Something out here doesn't want us leaving." He gestured to the display. "Which means we push forward." The ship cut through the wreckage, navigating a corridor of forgotten battles. Then, through the shifting debris, something emerged from the dark. At first it looked like another wreck, a massive structure, its hull lacerated by time and violence. But as they drew closer, the architecture revealed itself. It wasn't a ship, it was a station, still powered, its exterior marked with Earth-based engineering. Voss's pulse pounded. This place, it's human. Vale's voice was low. Then why isn't it on any records? Soren turned to Stroud. "Can we dock?" Stroud's fingers hovered over the console. "Airlocks are intact, but this place has been sealed from the inside. Someone didn't want visitors." Cray checked his weapon. "Which means we knock first." The Solace latched onto the station's docking port. The airlock doors hissed open, revealing a corridor thick with the scent of stagnant air, metal, and something older. They stepped inside. The silence pressed against them, not empty, but watchful. Light panels flickered, casting long, uneasy shadows across the walls. Soren's voice was measured. "Stay sharp." They moved forward past consoles still active but looping encrypted data, past doorways sealed by reinforced blast locks, until they reached a chamber that hummed with residual power. Voss stopped at the threshold. His breath hitched. At the center of the room was a medical containment unit, tubes snaking from its base, the glass surface coated in frost. The interface still registered vitals, weak but stable. And inside, a man. Vale took a slow step forward. "That's impossible." Voss barely heard him, his focus locked onto the face behind the glass, frozen in time but unmistakable. Dr. Adrian Falk. Cray let out a sharp breath. "He's alive?" Soren scanned the vitals. "If you can call it that." The screen beside the pod flickered to life, triggered by their presence. Lines of coded script unraveled, a final message buried beneath years of silence. Voss read the words aloud, voice barely above a whisper. "The virus was never meant to kill. It was meant to bring them back." A mechanical whir echoed through the chamber. The containment pod unlocked itself. The frost-covered glass began to slide open. Cray's hand tightened on his weapon. "Doc, you might want to step back." Falk's eyes snapped open. They weren't human anymore. The station's alarm screamed to life. A hidden voice within the systems broke through the static, low and final. "They are waking up!" Falk's eyes snapped open, and in that instant, something shifted in the air. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, an electric charge running through the chamber, prickling against skin like unseen static crawling up their spines. Voss took an involuntary step back. He had seen death in all its forms, violent, slow, twisted by biology. But this was different. Falk wasn't dead. He wasn't alive in any way Voss recognized either. The containment pod hissed as frost evaporated off the glass. Tubes retracted, detaching from Falk's skin with a wet, mechanical slither. His fingers twitched first, then his jaw, like a man adjusting to a body that wasn't his anymore. Cray's grip on his rifle tightened to the point of whitening his knuckles. "Voss, tell me this is normal. Tell me this is something you expected." Voss's throat felt dry. "Nothing about this is normal." Falk's lips parted, but no breath escaped. His chest didn't rise or fall. He stood perfectly still, only his pale, empty gaze sweeping over them, as if cataloging each of their faces, burning them into something beyond memory. Then he spoke. "You're late." Vale's fingers hovered over his sidearm. "Falk, you're supposed to be dead." Falk's head tilted ever so slightly. "So were they." The lights flickered. A low, mechanical groan trembled through the station's walls, as though something ancient was stretching, waking up. Soren didn't waste time. "Explain." Falk's lips curled at the edge, something almost like amusement, but beneath it, something else lurked. Something not human. "I see you found my work," he said, voice like rust scraping across metal. "And now you think you understand it." His gaze flicked to Voss. "You don't." Voss stepped forward despite every instinct screaming at him to back away. "You engineered the virus." Falk blinked once, slow. The virus was never the goal. It was the key to an old door. Vale cut in, voice sharp. "To what end?" Falk's eyes met his, and for the first time, something flickered behind them. Not recognition, not memory, but something vast, like staring into the open maw of a thing that had existed far too long. "To wake us up." The station shuddered, as though it had been listening to the conversation and decided now was the time to speak. Voss's pulse thundered in his ears. "What did you do?" Falk's gaze didn't leave his. "I remembered what we were." A crackle of static tore through the intercom, but this time it wasn't just distortion. Voices, layered, whispering, echoing, overlapping. Cray's jaw clenched. "We need to leave." "No," Falk said simply. "You need to listen." Voss moved toward the terminal, scanning the decrypted data that had begun streaming across the laser plasma display. The virus, the genetic anomalies, the evolution on Dryneth 4, then, buried deep in the code, a timestamp, not from the present, not from the past, from before recorded history. Voss's breath hitched. "This doesn't make sense." "Because you still believe the lie," Falk murmured, stepping forward. His movements weren't rushed, weren't hesitant. They were deliberate, like he was adjusting to an old rhythm. "You think humanity was always small, always struggling to find its place in a universe that rejected it." Voss's fingers tightened against the console. "We were." Falk smiled, but it was a brittle thing, something born from old wounds. "No," he said. "We were the first." The weight of the words hit like gravity shifting sideways. Soren spoke before anyone else could. "Prove it." Falk reached out, placed his palm against the terminal, and the station's systems reacted immediately. Lights flared, interfaces unlocked, and the room filled with the sound of data being rewritten. Then, the walls themselves became screens, and history unfolded in front of them. Images, glimpses of ancient fleets, stretching beyond what modern humanity had ever conceived possible. Cities not built on planets, but in the cold abyss of space itself, hanging between stars like monuments to an empire long forgotten. Then, the war, planets burning, ships fracturing under unimaginable forces. Humanity's enemies weren't the ones they knew now. They were older, colder, deeper. Cray took an uneasy step back. What the hell am I looking at? Falk's voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like an echo of something that had been waiting to be spoken for centuries. The war that ended our reign. Voss felt the weight in his chest crush him inward. This isn't possible. It's inevitable, Falk corrected. We weren't meant to be small. We were meant to be forgotten. The images flickered, shifting to something worse. Not destruction, not defeat, containment. They had been sealed away, not as punishment, not as exile, but because humanity had become something the galaxy had feared. Falk turned to them. We were put to sleep, our history erased. The virus was never about death. Voss whispered the only answer that made sense. It was about waking us up. The station trembled violently, and suddenly the voices in the static weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands. Vale moved fast. We have to get out of here. Falk didn't follow. He just watched them, head tilting slightly. You already opened the door. Soren grabbed Voss's arm, dragging him toward the exit. Move! The alarm screamed, the station's internal power surging as something massive began shifting beneath their feet. The station wasn't a relic, it was a lock, and now it was opening. Cray hit the comms. Stroud, prep for immediate departure. Stroud's voice crackled through the static, barely audible over the alarms. We've got incoming, something's moving out here. They ran. Behind them, Falk's voice carried through the roaring systems, almost drowned out, but still too calm. It was never about survival. Soren shoved the airlock override. The doors groaned, struggled, then released. They boarded the Solace just as the station began to crack apart, energy rippling along its structure like the first signs of something breathing after too long a sleep. Voss barely made it to his seat before Stroud launched them into a desperate burn away from the facility. Vale exhaled sharply, hands braced against the console. What just happened? Soren's gaze was locked on the heads-up display. We didn't just find the past. He looked at them, face pale but steady. We woke it up. And behind them, deep in the dark sector of space, something began to rise. We woke it up. Soren's words hung like a shadow over the bridge, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The Solace surged forward, cutting through the dark sector, with all the thrust Stroud could push into its engines. But behind them, something stirred in the black, a force that had been buried, forgotten, and now, because of them, was rising. The heads-up display was a flurry of warnings. Energy surges pulsed from the station as it fractured apart, splitting open like something breaking out of a shell. The wreckage around them wasn't just shifting, it was being drawn toward the awakening structure. Talk to me, Stroud, Soren ordered, his gaze locked on the display. Are we clear? Stroud's fingers danced over the controls. Not even close. Whatever we triggered, it's pulling in every dead ship out here. Some kind of gravitational field. It's not natural. Voss barely heard them. His focus was on the data he had pulled from the station. The fragments of code, the old war records, the final words Falk had left behind. The virus was never about killing. It was about awakening something buried deep within human DNA. Vale's voice cut through his thoughts. We need a plan. Running isn't going to work if we don't know what we're running from. Soren exhaled sharply, eyes cold. We don't run, we position. Cray frowned. Position for what? Soren leaned over the console, tapping through the tactical interface, bringing up a star map of the surrounding region. His jaw was set like stone. For control. Voss looked up, reading the unspoken meaning in Soren's expression. You want to turn this into an engagement. Soren's voice was measured, steady. This isn't a skirmish anymore. Earth thinks they can erase us. The Consortium wants us buried. Whatever we just woke up out here, it's an unknown factor, and unknowns make people panic. Vale nodded slowly. You want to use that against them? Soren's gaze flicked to him. You're the diplomat. Tell me I'm wrong. Vale's lips pressed together in thought. Panic creates mistakes. If we force the Consortium to believe they've lost control of the narrative, They'll start turning on each other. Cray scoffed. That's great, but we've got bigger problems, like the actual thing we just woke up. Voss clenched his fists. We can't just react to it. We have to figure out how it thinks. Soren nodded. Then let's assume it's intelligent. What's its first move? Voss stared at the readouts, watching the energy signatures spike and shift in patterns that weren't random. He narrowed his eyes. It's scanning, he realized. It's not attacking, it's looking. For what? Cray asked. Voss's throat tightened. For us. A sharp alert flashed across the display, a distress signal, but not from the Solace. Vale stiffened. That's coming from a Consortium warship. Soren's eyes narrowed. Patch it through. The signal crackled to life, filled with distorted shouting. We are under attack. Unknown force detected. No, 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 they're inside the ship. They're not. Silence. The signal cut. Stroud swallowed. That was fast. Vale exhaled. We're not the only ones who triggered this. Soren straightened. Then we use that. Cray's brow furrowed. Use what exactly? Soren turned back to the tactical display. The Consortium fleet is still searching for us, right? They don't know what's happening out here. Vale's eyes widened as he followed the logic. If we make it look like this thing is targeting them, Soren nodded. We turn their paranoia into our shield. Voss hesitated. That's a dangerous gamble. Soren's expression didn't shift. Everything worth winning is... Vale pulled up the available fleet positions. We need a way to disrupt their communication relays. If we can isolate their ships, feed them misinformation, they'll start firing on ghosts. Stroud tapped the controls. There's a comms satellite network in this region. Old infrastructure, but still active. If we tap into it, we can reroute signals, make it look like their ships are going dark one by one. Soren nodded. Do it. Cray frowned. And what about the actual threat? Voss looked at the energy readings again. It's not attacking indiscriminately. It's targeting. Whatever Falk did to himself, whatever was in the virus, it's drawn to something specific in human DNA. Vale gave him a sharp look. You're saying it's looking for people like Falk? Or people who were meant to become like him? A cold silence settled over the room. Cray exhaled. Fantastic. So we've woken up something that's selectively hunting us. Stroud's console beeped. We're approaching the comms satellite network. Vale straightened. Then let's make our enemies start hunting each other instead. Stroud engaged the infiltration protocols, rerouting data traffic, manipulating signals. Within moments, the Consortium's fleet began shifting positions, reacting to phantom threats, moving in erratic, desperate formations. Then, the first shot was fired. One Consortium ship mistook another's movement for an attack and retaliated. Soren watched it unfold. That's one. Seconds later, another ship opened fire on a false target, then another. The confusion spread like wildfire. Vale exhaled. Now we see how long it takes before someone realizes they've lost control. But Voss's focus was elsewhere. His eyes were locked on the growing storm behind them, the anomaly, the force Falk had woken, now moving with more purpose. They're not reacting to this, he realized. They don't care about the Consortium. Soren turned toward him. Then what do they care about? Voss's stomach twisted. Us! Before anyone could respond, a new alert flashed red across the display. Warning. Unknown contact. Closing fast. Cray's grip tightened on his weapon. It's coming straight for us. Vale's voice was calm, but his knuckles were white. Then we just became its priority. Stroud adjusted the flight controls, his expression tense. Commander? Soren's gaze burned cold as he took in the pieces on the board. Then we changed the game. The Solace turned, and for the first time since this all began, they weren't running anymore. The Solace twisted through the dark, its thrusters burning with reckless intent. Behind them, the thing that had woken stirred, its presence pressing against the edges of known space like a beast testing the walls of its cage. Stroud's voice cut through the tension. It's closing fast. If we don't change course, we're going to be the first name on its list. Soren's gaze stayed locked on the heads-up display, his breath even, measured. Then we stop running. Vale exhaled sharply. Tell me that doesn't mean what I think it means. It means, Soren said, we make it see us. Cray straightened, his rifle shifting in his hands. That thing already sees us, Commander. Question is, does it see us as prey? Soren's eyes burned cold. Not if we make it see us as something else. The bridge was silent, except for the steady rhythm of incoming data scrolling across the console. Voss, still reading the decrypted files Falk had left behind, suddenly froze. The virus wasn't meant to infect. It was meant to activate. A failsafe built into us a long time ago. And if this thing is reacting to it, Vale finished the thought. Then it remembers what we were. Cray glanced between them. You're suggesting we can reason with it? Voss shook his head. I'm suggesting we remind it why we weren't erased. The proximity alarm screamed. The anomaly was no longer just approaching. It was here. The ship's lights flickered. A vibration thrummed through the hull. Not a weapon impact, not an explosion. Something deeper. Something aware. Soren pushed forward. Stroud, hold us steady. Vale's fingers danced across the console, rerouting auxiliary power to amplifiers. If it thinks we're nothing but remnants, we make sure it hears the whole story. Voss's hands hovered over the command panel. Are you sure about this? Soren nodded once. Loud and clear, Doc. Open the channel. A transmission flared into the dark. No language. No coded message. Just a pulse. A single signal laced with something buried inside every human. The thing paused. The heads-up display flickered. Readouts spiked into unreadable parameters. The entire ship shuddered, but the anomaly did not attack. It watched. Cray's grip on his rifle remained tight. That's either a good sign or the start of a bad ending. Voss barely breathed as he watched the reading shift. It's scanning us, not like a machine, like it's remembering. A voice, layered, ancient yet eerily familiar, spilled into the comms. Not a transmission, not interference. Director, immediate, inside the ship itself. You are not them. Voss's pulse pounded. Who is them? The ones who turned away, the ones who forgot. Vale leaned forward, eyes sharp. Forgot what? Silence. Then, you. Soren exhaled. It doesn't see us as new. It sees us as lost. Voss stared at the undulating mass beyond the viewport, realization coiling in his gut. It was never hunting us. It was looking for what was left of us. Cray's jaw tensed. And now that it's found us? The entity's presence pressed against the ship's shields, not in hostility, but in something more deliberate. You are awake. Soren nodded. We are. A pause. Then prove it. Before they could react, the entire sector ignited. The Consortium fleet had finally caught up. Their ships arrived in tight formation, their weapons locked onto the Solace and the entity alike. Incoming hail, Stroud announced grimly. Soren didn't hesitate. Patch them in. The laser plasma display flared to life, revealing the severe expression of Admiral Lysar Carr. His face was set like carved stone. You've led us on a long chase, Commander, Carr said. It ends now. Soren didn't blink. That's where you're wrong. Carr barely reacted. Stand down. Surrender the ship and the data. The alternative is complete annihilation. Vale's voice was a razor's edge. You don't even know what you're firing at. Carr's gaze flicked past them to the looming entity, its shifting form casting eerie shadows across the bridge. It doesn't matter. This is containment. You were never meant to open this door. Voss exhaled. That's what this was always about. Not protecting humanity, keeping us from remembering. Carr's silence was answer enough. Soren stepped forward. We're done taking orders from ghosts. The Admiral's expression didn't waver. Then you leave us no choice. The fleet's weapons charged. Before the first shot fired, the entity moved. Not toward the Consortium, toward them. Show me. Voss barely had time to react before a surge of energy erupted through the ship, wrapping around them like a second skin. The lights dimmed, the air grew heavy, and then it showed them. Memories not their own but familiar. A war fought in a time before time, planets burning under human hands, enemies not conquered, but erased. Not because they were a threat, but because they tried to erase humanity first. The entity's voice echoed through them. You were not small. The fleet fired. The entity stretched, absorbing the impact, shifting, bending light itself. The Consortium ships reeled, their systems failing, their movements fractured by something they could not comprehend. Carr's face twisted in shock. What? Soren didn't give him time to finish. Now, he ordered. The Solace surged forward past the stunned fleet, past the confusion, past the fear. They weren't running. They were leaving them behind. Vale looked back at the collapsing Consortium formation, his voice quiet. They were never ready for this. Soren's grip on the console was firm. That's their problem. The entity watched them go, its form shifting one last time. Find the others. Voss's breath caught. There are more. The presence faded, its purpose complete. Stroud punched in coordinates. Where to, Commander? Soren's gaze was unwavering. Somewhere they haven't buried yet. The Solace vanished into the black, but this time they weren't just survivors. They were something the galaxy had feared would return, and they were awake.